Welcome to Ink Thinks. If you've been anywhere on the internet for the last few months, there is almost zero chance that you haven't heard people talking about Among Us. YouTubers are discussing it, streamers are featuring it, the game has absolutely exploded. Despite being around since only about halfway through 2018, it's recently become one of the most talked about games globally, and especially finding fame in the West. With this newfound fame, I've seen several requests to have Among Us be featured in Super Smash Bros. Some of these requests have been ironic, but others have been serious suggestions, so I want to take the possibility itself seriously. Apart from the imposter's likelihood, which I'm going to discuss later this week, I want to take a minute and talk about the social ramifications that would happen if Among Us was represented in the game, and what it would say about Smash and how it would affect the culture going forward. So when it comes to Among Us getting into Super Smash Bros., I think that there's two big ramifications that would happen to the scene if they were included. The first would be that of legacy and what it says for games needing a legacy to be featured in Smash Bros., and the other would be that of moveset, which once again I've referred to as the zombie argument from hell that will not die because it just keeps coming back. So let's start with that one. I hear time and time again for a ton of different characters that there just isn't a moveset for them. I've heard it about Waluigi, I've heard it about Sora even, I've heard it about Among Us, I've heard it about just about anyone you could think of. I've heard it about Steve, and it just never seems to die. I guess there's some sort of perception that Sakurai is going to be unable to represent a character faithfully in their game while giving them a good moveset, and I don't understand where that's coming from. We've seen time and time again that Sakurai is able to produce a really cool result that harkens back to the original games pretty meaningfully. I mean, we can see that in Piranha Plant, who had a pretty limited moveset to pull from, but somehow his moveset just feels so right. And we can also see it in Steve, who once again, his game isn't really focused on combat, but you can see probably the most faithful representation in all of Smash with his inclusion. I think a really big example of Sakurai's innovation with movesets though can be seen in Captain Falcon. This is a character who's been around since Super Smash Bros. 64, but before that he had never been seen outside of his car. He's from a racing game, F-Zero. And despite him not having any sort of moveset to pull from, like literally zero, Sakurai was able to just make his moveset feel so natural and feel so right. Even if it doesn't capture actual actions that the character does, it perfectly captures the feel of the game. F-Zero is a super flashy, fast-paced game, and Captain Falcon's playstyle echoes that very well. So if an imposter from Among Us was added to Smash, I think that this would be just another dent in the idea that Sakurai is going to have trouble finding a moveset for someone. I mean, sure, you can see different attacks in the kill animations in the game, but largely there isn't a ton to pull from. And I think that seeing Sakurai be able to represent an Among Us moveset pretty faithfully would just do another big blow to this argument. Another thing that I want to talk about real fast with the no moveset argument is the sheer amount of fan creativity that goes behind some of these characters. You can find movesets for just about anyone online, especially several popularly requested characters that might not have immediately obvious movesets. There were ones for Steve, there's some for Freddy Fazbear, and I'm sure you can find some for Among Us as well. I guess my point here is that if fans can come up with an awesome moveset in probably what doesn't take them a terrible amount of time, I guarantee that Sakurai and his team can come up with something just as good, if not better. But I think that the biggest social contribution if Among Us was added to Smash is what it says about a game needing a legacy to be featured in Super Smash Bros. In my Fortnite video last week, I talked about how if Jonesy was added to Smash, it would show that Nintendo is kind of leaning towards a new generation of gaming. Fortnite is relatively new and it appeals to a lot of the younger generation of gaming, and so a lot of people from that generation are wanting to see it, or at least most of the people I see wanting Fortnite and Smash are from that generation. That said, Among Us is a bit of a different story. While they're both from new generations of gaming, Among Us doesn't have the same sort of legacy that Fortnite has. They're both huge games and they both have been widely talked about for a good amount of time, but there's a stark difference between the two. Fortnite has seen huge crossovers with real life people, with Marvel, with Disney, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. There just seems to be event after event and new crossover after new crossover, and Fortnite, by the time it leaves, if it leaves, it's going to have left a huge impact on the world, or at least on the world of gaming. I mean, you can just see the ramifications of it in the form of battle royale games that started popping up everywhere after Fortnite. But Among Us doesn't necessarily have that same legacy behind it. Sure, it's super popular. In fact, I've heard it talked about more than Fortnite lately. But I think that it's important to distinguish between a newfound generation icon like Fortnite and a really fun game that's coming in a phase, which is what I think Among Us is going to be. Mobile games are an interesting thing to try to represent in Super Smash Bros. And I know that you can also play Among Us on a PC, but it's largely a mobile game. Like I said, mobile games are difficult because the landscape changes so fast due to the easy to download nature of these games. I'm old enough to remember several huge games that did their time and then kind of faded into the background. There was Angry Birds, Plants vs. Zombies, Temple Run, Flappy Bird. Every few years there's a new super popular game that gets a lot of attention. And while Among Us seems to be a lot more mainstream as far as the media I consume, I don't see anything to really suggest that it's going to have a longer lasting impact than Flappy Bird, which was also incredibly popular at the time. And so I think that the inclusion of Among Us would really say a lot about Nintendo's view of a character having a legacy. Because if they were to add Fortnite, like I said, it's new, but it's definitely left an impact. Among Us is new and popular, but Nintendo would really be putting all of its eggs into a basket with Among Us, and there's a good chance that the legacy of the Smash character would outlast the legacy of the game. And I guess that's one of the coolest things about Super Smash Bros. And something that I think isn't talked about enough with the franchise. Super Smash Bros. Isn't just a celebration of popular gaming or even iconic gaming throughout the ages, but it's also a legacy preserver. There have been fantastic games in the past that would have totally died off if it weren't for their inclusion in Super Smash Bros. The Mother series comes to mind, for example, or Game & Watch is a collection of games in a console that a lot of people wouldn't remember if it weren't for Smash, or even Fire Emblem, which didn't see huge success in the West until Marth and Roy were added to Melee. Super Smash Bros. Doesn't just take popular characters and puts them into a fighting game, but it takes popular characters and cements their legacy into a game that's going to be played for generations. And so while I don't think that popularity is the biggest factor for being added to Smash, I do think that it's important to separate out the legacy from the character with the popularity of the character. Among Us is an incredibly popular game. It's a ton of fun to play, even if I am terrible at the game. People always think that I'm the imposter. Regardless of whether or not I am, I'm usually out within the first 20 seconds of the game. And despite all of this fun and despite all of this success, I think that any real addition of Among Us and Super Smash Bros. Would be Nintendo taking a really big risk. Of course, theoretically, they'd have every right and possibility to add new popular games into Smash. I just feel like it would be taking Super Smash Bros. In a totally different direction. Now, there's no guarantee that a new popular game isn't going to pop up in a few months and then there's going to be people calling for that game and they've forgotten all about Among Us. The last thing that I want to mention real fast is the argument of cringe. I talked about this a little bit in my Fortnite video from last week. You can go check that out if you want to see my thoughts. But there's one key factor that I missed. My take last week was essentially that people cringe at titles that are newer than they are, if that makes sense. So if you're from one generation of gaming, newer generations of gaming are generally less appealing to you and are easier to fit into that cringe category. But something that I really missed is people cringing at games because of their fan base. I've noticed throughout the years that when something gets really popular, people tend to hate it, and I kind of associated that with oversaturation of the franchise within media, but I think a really big part of it is the fan base and how loud they are. When you get things like Undertale or Five Nights at Freddy's, or even crossing over into other media, things like Rick and Morty, or I even saw it with Frozen, you get a ton of people who are so passionate about this franchise and this series that they want to share it with everyone because they think it's the coolest thing out there. But because they're so passionate about it, people kind of get sick of hearing about it. And I think that while Among Us is really fun right now, I think in a few months it's going to reach that territory where the fan base is louder than the actual appeal for the game, and people are going to call it a cringe game. Now, personally, I don't think that the cringe argument is valid, and I see it as a form of gatekeeping. I just wanted to talk about this aspect of it that I missed last week, because I think it's important to separate the fan base from the game. We could have Fortnite and Smash, and that wouldn't necessarily mean anything is cringy. The fan base isn't coming with it, even if the fan base were cringy. The same thing goes with Five Nights at Freddy's. We would be getting the game's legacy, but not necessarily the huge fan base that comes with it. In fact, adding characters to Smash from one of these so-called cringe franchises might add new fans to the game that aren't as toxic and aren't as loud. Anyway, I could see that also factoring into Among Us, but only time will tell, I guess. Anyway, these are my thoughts on what I think the biggest problem would be with adding Among Us to Smash. Of course, could Nintendo do it? Yeah, are they likely to? You're gonna have to wait until later in the week to see my thoughts on that after I research it a bit more. But what's your take? Do you think that Among Us would be a good fit in Smash? And if not, tell me what you think the single biggest problem would be with it. Not in regard to its likelihood, but what it would say about games going forward for Smash. If you liked this, click the video on the right to binge this entire series. And if you want to see something that YouTube handpicked just for you, click the video on the left. But whatever you do, don't click the hidden link in the description, and make sure to hit subscribe if you want to see when I post, or hit the bell if you actually want to see when I post. Feel free to come talk to me on Discord if you want further discussion, but until next time, stay smashing.